these are, I think quite a bit about virtue theory and its role in education, in philosophy, and specifically pulling in some pictures or some of the features of dialogue. And I think that what's clear about a lot of what I've been looking into is just that kids can do philosophy. I mean, we have some here that maybe can attest to that in a bit, but I've been teaching these middle school philosophy classes every Friday for most of the year now, and I have just been absolutely blown away by what these kids are capable of. So it's raised a couple of questions for me, and so this is some stuff that I want to share that I've been thinking about that I think is kind of useful framing. And then some stuff that I'm really not sure how to think about them. So I'm gonna leave you all with some questions to maybe help me work through. Hopefully working through them or thinking through them will be helpful to you as well. But I have a handy dandy PowerPoint. Get things going. So as you'll probably know, we're talking about philosophy for children or philosophy with children, kind of however you'd prefer, and the cultivation of character and the virtues. So just to sort of start us out, I have these questions that are sort of like general aims. Like what are we supposed to be doing when we're doing philosophy with or for children? What are we hoping for? What are our goals? Then how do we best achieve those, right? And part of the question about best achieving those is going to be what the role of expertise is. And I know that there's some debate kind of in the philosophy for children literature about whether the sort of facilitator or instructor in the room during a community of inquiry or during philosophical discussions with kids, whether they need to be experts in philosophy or whether they need to have certain dispositions or whether they need to know much at all, or if they should be about on adult level playing field as some of these kids with these questions. Then another kind of related question is, what exactly are we communicating about what philosophy is and what the point of philosophy is when we're doing philosophy with children? I think this is a really important thing to consider, especially because there was a big APA survey that came out recently. I think Plato was involved also with first contact with philosophy and how important that first experience with philosophy is. And so it seems like we need to be really, really thoughtful about what it is exactly that we are saying that philosophy is, or that what it means to do philosophy well is, or who a good philosopher is, because especially kids are going to take that with them. Because then the kind of flip side of that is thinking about the potential risks of either not being thoughtful about these or having particular views about these that might not be conducive to our aims. So I think the kind of main answer to this question of what are we trying to do is probably something in line with critical thinking, or Mike Pritchard talks about reasonableness as kind of the goal of doing philosophy, and especially philosophy with children. Or kind of the more contemporary movement is to talk about cultivating either intellectual virtues, moral virtues, democratic virtues, or just virtues in general. So here we have, this is something that I think if you've had to write a syllabus before, or if you've ever sat in a meeting about education, people talk about critical thinking and teaching critical thinking all the time. I won't read through all of this, but this is just to show in the early mid-90s, the APA did a kind of big panel of like 50 different people working together to get an account of what critical thinking is, like what it is that critical thinking is, how we should do it, all that. So they came up with this very big, long answer, which, to kind of cut to the chase, pulled kind of the main ideas out of it on the left-hand side here. That they say, well, the critical thinker is someone who habitually is inquisitive, is well-informed, trusts reason, is open-minded, flexible, fair-minded, honest, prudent, willing to reconsider all sorts of their beliefs, others' beliefs, arguments, things like that. So they give this view of critical thinking as, some sort of approach to problem solving, but also in terms of being the sort of person who does these things constantly or over and over again habitually. And this is also how the virtue folks talk about it. And they focus more directly on, okay, we want to cultivate these habits. We want to be really intentional about getting people to work on becoming the sort of person who is a good listener, who is curious, who is careful or attentive to detail. So we see a pretty nice alignment here that I think is really useful, especially in philosophy for children, because these are the sorts of things that seems like we kind of can't go wrong with, at least as aims. I mean, I have a little bit of I think there's a potential worry that comes about when thinking about educating for the virtues, but I think most people would say, yeah, it's a good thing to be a good listener. It's a good thing to be curious, to be insightful, to be careful, things like that. And that's going to be different from an approach that says our goal in P4C or in philosophy classes is to teach certain content or to get it so that someone can reason through particular arguments about political or social issues or moral issues, because those can get sort of controversial, or there can be some question then about what it is we're doing, and if we're not, as instructors, as facilitators, trying to push kids into thinking certain ways or having certain values. So I think this is a pretty nice sort of semi-value neutral in some sense, maybe politically neutral framework of aims that we can approach. So with this sort of virtue framework, we can go all the way back to Aristotle here, but also Duncan Pritchard and Michael Croce have a really awesome paper, and I have it at the end, but have a really awesome paper on kind of contemporary equivalent of this. But basically the way that we cultivate virtues, become a curious person or a kind person or a humble person, is through habituation, practicing something over and over again, through teaching or exemplars. And Croce and Pritchard talk about like direct exemplars, where you just have someone who's doing a really good job modeling it. Maybe the teacher or the facilitator is doing a really good job as a listener, or as someone who is willing to admit when they're wrong, right? Or it could be sort of indirect, where the facilitator calls attention to a student who is listening really well, or is doing a really good job interacting with the other students. And then this last kind of third sort of cultivating virtues is a little bit anachronistic. It doesn't quite fit with Aristotle, but I think that it's in there to a large enough extent, given that he spends 2 of the 10 books of the Nicomachean Ethics talking about friendship, that our social interactions, our dialogues, are really important parts of our development as virtuous agents. So these kind of the interpersonal, right, the community-oriented piece of these dynamics is really important, and you don't really get that to the same extent by just focusing on practicing certain habits or looking at particular people who are exemplars or good teachers. So one piece that I should say, oh, do I go back? No, go back. There we go. Given Aristotle's framework, I think it's really useful for thinking about, but also he was very clearly wrong about children's abilities to do philosophy. He said that kids are just out of control, wild, passionate, emotional creatures, and that they need to sort that out and mature a bit in order to actually do philosophy. I think hopefully y'all are here because you're at least open to the idea that that's wrong. But I have even shared here, this is a screenshot of the whiteboard. So I typed all of this as kids were speaking from one of my middle school philosophy classes. So I asked, what is time? And everything on this page are things that students said. These are 10 to 13-year-olds. And And we got a couple of answers up and running, and then they started going in with, no, actually, it seems like you can't define it because you end up using time in your discussion of time. Even if you don't use the word, it's still in there. They started bringing in sort of all of these nuanced distinctions between measuring time or knowing that time has passed compared to like time actually passing. So like it's really incredible to see what kids can do with philosophy. Another one that's my favorite, and I will say it over and over again because I'm just floored, is I did paradoxes of time travel with my middle school students. And I offered like David Lewis's discussions of like, you need to distinguish in terms of possibility. There's like logical possibility, metaphysical, epistemic, and physical possibility. And I said, okay, here's a way out. And I kind of talked through some of the possibility distinctions. And one of the kids raised their hands and was like, okay, so in Back to the Future, that means that Marty goes back to a different world then, right? Because otherwise it was blah, 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 and like very clearly understood exactly what the kind of consequences of different approaches to time travel was. So I think the big takeaway here is that we really should take kids seriously as philosophers, and we shouldn't underestimate them. Of course, there are extremes to this. One end being, I think this happens in college a lot, where they just throw them in, sink or swim, and don't get them to the point where they can really engage with these ideas. But, you can imagine a sort of lecture style class where you're just talking at kids, and talking about really intense, distinctions in meta ethics or something like that. You can do meta ethics with middle school kids. I did it. It was great, but you can't do it just by starting out with like Moore's, some of Moore's distinctions or anything like that. You've got to ease them into it. So it seems like we want to find a balance between that side and then this other side, which might be a little bit controversial, but this is the piece where it's entirely child run. And this is a bit where I'm curious about what folks think about what it means to take kids seriously as philosophers. Because, presumably in high school, college classes with colleagues, things like that, you would take them seriously, right? Or probably in some sense more seriously than an 8-year-old, hopefully not that much more. But it strikes me that in like a college philosophy class, you have certain standards for them where you expect that their contributions are on task or are at least somewhat relevant, are that there are certain bounds of the interaction. And then also you want to call attention to or slow them down when things are going too quickly or when they're using big words that other kids in the class might not know, right? It seems like we want to have something that's sort of in the balance there so that it's not just kind of kids running off into thinking whatever they want to think about. Although that can be good, right? The digressions and different topics can be good. Seems like we want to have some bit of intentional direction in what we're doing. So sort of Aristotelian finding a balance here. So this is kind of to say that it strikes me that we, in order to take them seriously as philosophers, need to start by kind of getting a sense of what they already know. If we just start with the assumption that they don't know anything, then we aren't taking them seriously as knowers or potential knowers. Then the next bit is to help them in thinking and realizing that there are better and worse ways of engaging and thinking philosophically. And maybe that's a difference of degree as well in terms of, talking to 7-year-olds or 12-year-olds or 17-year-olds. But, if a kid wants to start talking about something completely inappropriate or is starting to go off track in maybe some fallacious reasoning or something like that, and the other students are jumping on it and going off on their own directions, then that might be a place where we want to slow down and say, okay, hold on, let's think about this, and let's take these ideas a bit more seriously. Then this last bit is, I think, to explicitly encourage the sort of virtuous behaviors. And this is to call attention to when students are engaging well with one another of, hey, so-and-so did a really, said something that was really thoughtful, or responded really nicely to so-and-so. That was a really nice interaction. Or it was really great that so-and-so was willing to admit that they weren't sure about that. And these you can use the sort of virtue language. And I found even with high school and college kids, and to a lesser extent middle school, it was really valuable to actually give them the language of the virtues to kind of praise that and turn their attention to it, so that they could think about things in those terms. And this is the end of it. I'm sorry, I know I've been talking too long, but I get excited about this. I think there is a potential worry, especially you talk about like moral education or virtue education or something like that with children, that immediately, alarm bells go off about indoctrination, or that, you're pushing particular values or ideals on people, on children, and that's problematic, especially if you're in a state institution, separation of church and state issues, things like that. And I think that there is a really big worry here that we need to be attentive to as we're kind of thinking about what we're doing. But I think a way we can get around this is, or at least a way that we can be sensitive to this concern, is the fact that, well, it seems like most of us, even the kids, right? I sat in on one of Debbie's classes, and these kids were like, yeah, it's important to be loyal and to respect one another and to have all, to be kind. And it's like, okay, great. Yeah, those are good virtues. Like, those are good ways to go through the world. But what do those mean? What does that look like? Where do they conflict? And really slowing down and actually having them like do the philosophical work surrounding the virtues as they're also using kind of virtuous, like using the virtues to engage with one another, I think helps them both in practice and also kind of conceptually work through for themselves what it is that they really care about and what problems they might see or what conflicts can come up for them. And so that can ultimately like empower them to have a better sense of what they care about and really understand what it is that they care about, as opposed to you guiding them and saying, okay, no, here's what intellectual humility is, or here's what kindness is, and this is how you do it. And then you give them some account, instead having them do that work for themselves. So I think the kind of questions that I have, but if I'm really excited and curious to hear what thoughts y'all have, would be this sort of questions about balancing the student-driven inquiry or student-driven discussion with balancing instructor expertise. Because it seems like in some cases, yeah, the instructor doesn't need to know a whole lot of philosophy at all to have and facilitate really great philosophical discussions. Like, I've seen it happen, and lots of, I'm sure some of you have had experience with that, and like that seems to be a really important piece. But if we also want it to be really student-led, then it's kind of difficult to see exactly how the content knowledge or the methodology knowledge, kind of the approaches to good, bad thinking or reasoning, slowing down, things like that, how those should play a role in the student-driven inquiry. And then just kind of generally, I'm curious what you all think about this sort of idea of approaching P4C or teaching for or with using the virtues, talking about virtues, but also like using virtues as a way to facilitate discussions. And if any of you have any sorts of experience with these sorts of things. So thank you all for listening there. These are some really great resources in case anyone's interested in sort of this virtue education stuff. I think they're really great. So thank you.